presenter, Caroline Dingle, will present first because she has to leave early. So it'll be Caroline Dingle, and then Pooja Kapai, and Tim Grunwald. And Caroline is looking at stories as statistics, gendered experiences within the sciences, Pooja Kapai, why Hong Kong's hidden stories matter, breaking through dominant discourses around racism, and Tim Grunwald narrating Place and Space, the story of sacred ground. There seems to be some themes here. I know some of these are mediated narratives, and also a general theme, perhaps of overlooked narratives in some ways, counter narratives. So without any further ado, let's hear from Caroline.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm going to start off by maybe apologizing, which I've been told you should never do, especially maybe as a woman talking in these situations. My presentation is not quite as polished. It's not because I didn't think about it or that I don't have things to say, but I didn't, well, so Stacy invited me to join this today because I've been interested in possibly trying to find a way to use stories about women in science, which we know are underrepresented, to convince people that don't believe that there's some problems, that there are some things that could be fixed. But narrative inquiry is not something very commonly used in science, if at all, and in fact there's probably quite a lot of negative connotations to it. And in fact we had a dinner with Peter and we were talking about this sort of problem of N of 1, which we always talk about sample size in science. So a story is an N of 1, it's just one person's story. And so I've been thinking a lot about how can we take these stories and create it into an N of many so it can be more convincing to my other scientific type colleagues. So I'm really glad to be here and thinking about and learning really a new way of gathering what I would call data, people's stories, and trying to find a way to make it useful. And I put this slide up here not necessarily to convince you that there is a problem, because you see the same patterns. Actually, somehow it doesn't look as bad in this one. I know the data is actually sort of worse, but maybe I just was doing this quickly. But you still see a drop-off, so we've got graduate students. This is from the Faculty of Science here. Graduate students on the right side, and then we've got the professor. And you see the same kind of drop-off that you do in most fields, most universities you look at everywhere in the world. We found there's a particularly big drop-off between PhD and postdoc at Hong Kong U. So postdocs kind of mixed in with RAPs and a bunch of other titles and academic related. And also in the Faculty of Science associate professor, we actually have only 4 female associate professors in the whole Faculty of Science. So I don't know where they're going because we have more professors than that, but somehow women in the middle are disappearing. But the reason I put this here actually today is because this is how we look at it a lot, especially in science. We love our data and our numbers and graphs and figures, and this really tells us as a problem. And it might hint at where the problem is, but it doesn't really tell us what's going on and how to fix the problem, because we don't know why that's happening. We don't know why PhD students are deciding not to become postdocs, or what's happening to these associate professors, where they're going. And I feel like this data is missing something, which is why I've been starting to look into the stories a little bit more and trying to figure out what's going on. And I would certainly say, like, among my female colleagues and the female students, we all kind of hear the same stories. We know it. But the problem is that other people that aren't women in science, don't necessarily believe it. And I've heard a range of things. You know, they just don't think it's a problem, or meritocracy, all the things we've heard everywhere. And so, yes, I guess my goal is to find ways to collect these stories and retell them in a way that's not necessarily, the goal isn't to make people feel bad or to point fingers, but just to really somehow create this picture so that people can see it more clearly, that there really is something that needs to be addressed. And I think I've been going back and forth about how exactly to go through this today, but I think I might start with this study that came out there's a study that came out 2016 in PLOS, the Public Library of Science. It's one of the big journals in science. And it's actually one of the studies I found where they have used narratives, it wasn't really narratives, I guess it was a survey, but they were asking students, faculty members, if they'd ever encountered sexual harassment. And what the study found in particular was that the majority of women that go to the field, so this is something that's particular in science, a lot of scientists have to go, I mean, I guess other fields do as well, but we spend a lot of time doing field work out in the field. And These can be often in really isolated places. I spent 2 years working out in the middle of the Amazon with no phone, no nothing, and I worked with 60 men. I was the only woman. And so they can be challenging conditions, stressful, and also places where you're likely to be vulnerable. And so this is actually came out before. It was an article that came out in the Atlantic in 2014, but talking about the same problem. And I thought this quote was particularly relevant because I think about, so how does sexual harassment lead to people dropping out? So this quote said, when students go into the field, they've been dreaming their whole lives to be like Jane Goodall. In case you don't know, I guess most people know who Jane Goodall is, but she spent a lot of time in Africa studying chimpanzees in pretty crazy conditions. She's kind of one of the major female idols from women in science. So they're realizing their life's dream in a really intense environment. So everything that happens really in that, because you're already living kind of at the edge of what you can tolerate in those situations, and that's mixed in with all your dreams and aspirations coming true. So anything that happens can make you question your place and if you're any good at this. And when I read that, that's kind of it. It's like there's these little things that happen, and our reaction isn't like, oh, that jerk. Our reaction is, oh, I'm probably not any good at this. Maybe I should do something else. And I know I've been through that. I feel like that's my reaction, but that's not the right reaction. Not the right reaction, but a reaction should be like, why is that guy getting away with this? Why is he doing that to me? And I say most of the cases are senior males to more junior females, although obviously not always the case. So I thought maybe from this I would tell you a few stories that have happened to me. It's small things, nothing really major, but it ties in also something that Athene Donald talked about last week, is like that maybe women are dropping out because of accumulation of very small things that on themselves are, I was never violently assaulted, or there was nothing major. They're all little things that, as one incident, I thought, that's annoying, but whatever. But maybe accumulation of those things are what drive people out. So probably, let's see, how far back should I go? Well, I can remember my very first experience. This is not an assault. They're not all sexual harassment things. I remember in 6th grade in the U.S. In Palo Alto, they used to change schools between 6th and 7th grade. And in my math class in 6th grade, I was very good at math when I was in 6th grade, and my best friend Kira also was. And the teachers had to make recommendations on what track we went into, whether we went into the AP, which is the honors track, or A or B lane. And neither one, my friend Kira and I, had been recommended for the AP track. We both really loved math, and we really were good at it. We wanted to. And I don't know what in me at that point, at the age of 11, we fought back with the teacher. We said, that's not fair. We want to go to AP math. And eventually we ended up in the AP math track. But at 11, that was the first time that someone had basically said, yeah, you're probably an A level. You're probably not quite AP. But we were just the same as everybody else. And then, so bringing back to this idea of field work, I remember this is one thing that's always stuck with me. So I did a lot of field work in Ecuador and the Amazon and the Andes Mountains, and everybody I worked with were men. We were out in the rainforest, we're getting muddy, and I'd already struggled for years to fit in with this, right? Because you don't want to be excluded. So I told fart jokes like the best of them, and drank beer, and we did all this stuff, and I did my best to be a guy, really. And that was okay, I was good at it, right? It was kind of fun, and I didn't really mind that stuff. But still, I found like I was being excluded from things, minor things. But this is one incident was something that sticks with me more. So once I got an opportunity to work with a very famous professor in my field. He's a male, he's an older guy. And it was great, he showed up to the field station and he really wanted to help me in the field. It was great, so we went out and had a fantastic day in the field. We did science together, we talked about science, he helped me catch my birds. Wonderful, it was a really great day, and we exchanged ideas, and I felt so scientific, I suppose, at the end of it. And then we came back to the field station, we were going to have movie night. So I was in the kitchen of the field station making popcorn. So I was standing at the stove, so it's like, it's an extremely female oriented image, but so I was cooking at the stove and I heard somebody come in, and it turns out this was a professor, and he didn't say anything, but he just came up and stood behind me and he pinched me on the butt. And I just completely ignored it, because I was like, what do I do? I'm still shaking this pan to make popcorn. I was like, this is so weird. And he just stood there for a little while, and then he turned around and left, and that was the end of it. So obviously it wasn't massively threatening and my friends were around and it was just annoying, but I thought about it for years after that because it was actually, I feel like a little part of me broke down that day because this is somebody I really respected and we had this great interaction in the field and I really felt we were equals in some ways, and then this happened and I was like, oh, well that was weird. So, you know, there's been several small things like that that add up over my lifetime, and maybe in some ways, I don't know, people are differently resilient to things too, right? Like I feel like I can handle all those little things, but what have they done to me? And then you think about people that might be more sensitive to these kind of things. Maybe they had a bad incident in their past, or they, whatever reason, that these cumulative small harassment, small microaggressions, whatever you call them, add up over time. So this kind of brings, there's pair situations I wanted to talk about, some stories that I've heard. So the first one was also in Ecuador. This is now, I'm a bit older and I'm starting to supervise students now. So, so the first one happened, well actually I was still a PhD student, we were working in the field, but there was a really, really remote station that was like, take all day on a boat to get out to, and I didn't go up to this site, but this colleague I was working with sent a couple students out there, and one of them was a woman, and again she was the only woman, lots of men. But you know, we can survive in these situations, so that's not the problem. But she had I think she had a relationship with one of the guys there. She was there for a week, but they fooled around or whatever. And in the end, she felt kind of uncomfortable about it, and I think she probably realized how far away she was from everybody, and she came back and reported something about it. Not to get him in trouble, but just to say, I got in this awkward situation. And the result was that the program stopped letting female students go to that site. Male students could still go, but female students weren't allowed to go anymore. And I really argued about this. I was like, that just doesn't seem like the right response to me. I mean, maybe the better thing is to have a chaperone go, or not let anybody go, or something like that. One of my friends really argued, that they were responsible for the safety of these students, and that just felt like the best solution, not let them get into the situation where something might happen. Which brings me to something that's happened here that really is on a different level, but, and I know actually one of our students has talked about this at a previous event, but I like to talk about it because also the reaction afterwards was quite interesting to me. So in the biology building here on campus, the Kaduri building, that weird blue building, all of the female bathrooms are locked. So to go into the bathroom, you have to get a key. And for some weird administrative reason, not everybody's allowed to have their own key, so I guess it's probably also for safety, so you have to have a key in the lab, and they get lost, and I know as a visitor I've often been in that building and really had to go to the bathroom, and I couldn't get into the bathroom because I don't have a key. So there's a disabled bathroom there, accessible bathroom, but often seriously this happened to me once where I went to that bathroom, there's 3 people in line for that one, because none of them had a key. So I went down a floor, that one was occupied with someone in line, so I had to go down another floor to go to the bathroom. Okay, so it's a minor inconvenience. The reason why it's locked is because 10 years ago or so, there was somebody went in there and I don't know, they had a camera or taking pictures, something creepy happened. But again, it seemed like an overkill reaction to me to now lock this bathroom, and the inconvenience is the women in that case. And also I think all the other bathrooms in the world are locked, not in the world, but on campus. Okay, so it seems like not a very major incident. Although the women talk about it, we had a women in science meeting, we're not joking, for a whole entire hour we talked about the bathroom problem. So it's obviously something that affects people, and it creates this weird dynamic that's kind of interesting. The reason I also wanted to talk about it is when the student talked about it, was one of the He for She events earlier in the year, the reactions afterwards of all the male members of staff in that department were like, oh, I really wish she hadn't, that was so stupid, why would she bring that up, that's not a big deal, it's not, and that's exactly where the story thing comes in. It's a big deal. I sat in a room with all the women in science, we talked about it for an hour. So it's obviously affecting how women in that department feel, they're perceived, how they think about themselves on a small level, right? It's one small thing, but we've seen that these small things add up. And so I think what I'd like to do with stories, and what I hope to be able to achieve, is to collect these stories from women in science, all small things, whatever, random, big things, small things, whatever, and turn them into somehow, I said statistics, some kind of data that we can then present in a way to say, like, these things do matter. We brought up the bathroom thing not because it was a silly story, or not because obviously no one's really threatened by it, no one's going to drop out of science because the bathroom door is locked. But it's one of the small things that might add up and drive people out. So hopefully, with the help of you guys, because I have no idea how to do this in any rigorous kind of way that my colleagues would accept. But it's been interesting, and actually, so that's, as we've gone through today, this morning, just doing this writing workshop and thinking about all of these things are changing my mind about what this is about. So this morning we were supposed to write about why we want to write, why are we doing this? And I started by writing, I want to do it to make other people able to tell their stories and maybe translate those stories into a language that can be understood by data geeks. But as I was writing, I was like, but actually I also want to tell my story. And I tell you the story. I was actually hesitating whether I tell you the stories about me getting my butt pinched, because it's a little embarrassing, and I don't want to be it's not really about me, but of course it's also about me, and I want to be able to tell my story, but I will be able to do that better if I know it's not unique. If I'm speaking for the many by telling my story, that makes me more willing to speak up as well. So this day has been really quite interesting for that, and seeing in all these different contexts how you can use it. Looking at your videos made me think, maybe that's something that could be interesting, although I guess people probably want to be more anonymous if they're talking about things that have happened to them. But anyways, I guess that's mostly what I wanted to say. So I'm new at this. I don't really have any data to tell you or stories to show how we've done it yet, but we're collecting stories, and I'd be eager to talk with people if you have ideas about what to do with them.
We're taking questions and comments for Caroline now because she has to leave a little early. So if you have any. Yes.
Just a point of information. Have you seen the study that Imperial College commissioned on gender and their culture?
I'm not sure.
It's
No,
the Imperial College in London, which of course
Yeah.
is very science dominated.
Mm-hmm.
They commissioned a study of, particularly because they were concerned about sort of gender relations within the institution, and because there was an incident involving their rugby club, sort of major sexual harassment case, blah blah. So they commissioned a study of the culture of the college, and it is published. And actually, I sent it to Sick Ying. So it's here because I thought it's useful ammunition for anything you're complaining about here. Because LSE has done one as well, which is rather different.
Yeah.
But the Imperial College one, I think, is really quite interesting in terms of what it's done, and you might find that interesting because, as well, in terms of how to present data, because they used a mixture of quantitative and qualitative data. So I just thought you might find that helpful.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good thing to look at. I know also Athene Donald talked last week, whatever, a few weeks ago when she was here, about a study that they had done looking at, it was a slightly different question, but related, asking women how they define success for themselves, which still kind of gets at this question of what's female experience in science compared to male experience in science. And I think also Dame Barbara Stocking mentioned one also from Cambridge where they look specifically at women in science, so that would be a good place to start.
I just wanted to ask a really quick question because it was a stunning chart that you showed of the associate professors having only 4, and whereas more professors than associate professors in science. And I think that it would be interesting to find out the stories of the professors' careers and how many of them were hired in at that rank. And I'm wondering how many went through the system and how many were hired at the professor rank. Because I find that particularly here at Hong Kong U, it's an issue that people do not move through the system. In other words, they don't come in as assistant and move into professor. That instead they drop out of the system and people hire in at the higher ranks.
Right. And
I'm curious about those stories and trying to get at, how people are hired and why they do not move through the system.
yeah, it's really interesting. One of the things we've been thinking about is trying to do leaving interviews with people that were leaving.
Yeah.
But why not ask people that are here already about their hiring history? So it's a good point because it's something when we looked at this, I should mention that the Faculty of Science has recently formed we're calling ourselves the self-assessment team, but it's basically what you guys did in the Faculty of Arts. So we've been looking at the data and trying to collect some of this information. So we got this result, we're kind of puzzled. It's like how do you get at that? How do you figure out what's happening there? So I guess that's That's a good point, that a narrative approach would be a perfect way to fill in that gap.
Yeah, really,
That's good.
get those stories.
And it'd be short because there aren't that many of them. It wouldn't take very long.
Any other questions or comments?
I do have one. It's something I'm going to sort of talk about a little bit, but I do want to hear from you. What you mentioned about the resistance in your department to even listening to some of these stories or trivializing them. How do you engage with colleagues who have sort of an automatic switch off when it comes to certain issues? And we know gender in society generally has this sort of impact. Have you sort of considered looking at conversations around gender, sexuality, and other area studies which elicit a similar response? At least, I think many people in the room will be able to tell you we deal with it day in, day out.
Yeah. So do you mean looking at artist studies or just having conversations with people?
Well, I think it might be instructive to talk to activists in the field who face and deal with these resistances, and then to consider, what strategies or approaches they've found effective to engage with people who have the power, but who might not want to listen to what you have to say.
Yeah, that's a good idea. That's something I think about a lot too. I know it's come up in conversations around some of these events in the past, because at first I thought you were asking me how I deal with it when I hear my colleagues say things that, to be honest, I usually don't say anything to them. I can then complain about it with all the women in science. But I rarely have felt comfortable enough to say, certainly not to a senior professor or something, to call them out on, because I don't want them to think, oh, well, you're just a woman in science, of course you would say that. So that's a really difficult question. But yeah, it was interesting because it's something I thought about while watching your videos when you were interviewing the female activists and how they felt and maybe even just thinking about that more as well, trying to get at what's the personal feeling. And that's something I was thinking about. So what would be really interesting is not necessarily even cataloging incidences of harassment or negative comments that people have said, which I think is interesting too, but actually how do you feel going through the day? Because that's something else I thought about today is I often have this conflict between being annoyed at these things that happen that people have said or that I've observed, and then also questioning myself constantly, coming back to that quote, maybe I'm actually just not good enough. Maybe it's not because I've had this series of microaggressions. Maybe I'm just not suited to be a scientist. Maybe I should do something else. And I probably go through that in my head 10 times a day. Maybe not often. Some days, probably not often. But trying to get at really people's inner dialogues with themselves as well about how they feel about these things.
Just a quick comment. Having talked to you for over a year now, I had never really understood the specifics of your story. So for us who know you well, even, it was really enlightening. And when your discussion of the missing middle, it made me think, because there are some great biographies now and memoirs of women scientists, but they are significantly older. And there's all this energy around young women and STEM. So it's not just, your point about the data, and Gina's point about it's graphs, it's career stories, but you literally could present your story as you front it. It's your memoir, but everybody supports. It wouldn't take much to gather. You have amazing women here at home on you, and I think there would be energy to mobilize that small archive right away. And I think it would have international significance as well.
Yeah. Then she might be making it anonymous, though, right? I feel like from talking to the students and everything that people don't really want to share those stories because they feel like the repercussions would be, even on whether I get fired for saying something, probably not, but you probably wouldn't get invited to the pub very often if you're criticizing your colleagues, and that has repercussions too. Sure. But, yeah, that'd be interesting.
Creative nonfiction, right?
Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks. And if anyone has any other thoughts about it later, please contact me because I am really lost in the dark here, although less today after today, but and I'm excited and motivated to do it, so thanks.
So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for staying on into the afternoon. It's really great to actually follow Caroline because I think that there'll be some nice connecting dots between the two presentations. So I'm going to present on a project that was very close to my heart. It's been many years sort of in the contemplation, but it's only sort of seen the light of day very recently for me. And there's a journey behind it, or a story behind it, which I'd like to start off sharing with you. So when I first started in the field about 10, 12 years ago, and colleagues would say, so what are you going to talk about, or what are you going to research as an academic, because I used to be a lawyer before, a practicing lawyer. And so I'd say, well, I really want to do work on gender, racism, diversity, and I got a lot of sort of quizzical looks. So why this work? Is racism even an issue in Hong Kong? Has it ever happened to you? Has someone discriminated against you? How dare they? Or, but you seem to be doing fine, right? You have a certain privilege, clearly. You were a practicing lawyer, you now moved professions, so you had the choice and capacity to do that. And so in a way, your truths are constantly questioned. Your success contradicts your truth or what you're claiming. And then, the kind of second guessing that Caroline was referring to. Is it real or is it just in my head? Did somebody just make a comment that was misogynistic or racist? Or am I just oversensitive here? So there's nothing there. According to colleagues at the time, peers at the time, they said there really isn't much scope for this kind of work, so maybe you might want to pick something different. And I did pick something more mainstream. So at that time I was interested in looking at contract law. But this never quite left me, because there's this nagging feeling that, it is real, it's happening. But why isn't there any acknowledgement or interest in sort of developing this field further? And then, of course, the idea that you're perhaps being a victim. Sorry, I didn't realize that I didn't share this slide with you. So these ideas that sort of were percolating for a long time started to take on sort of new life, because gradually the accumulation of a lot of these sort of instances or observations really force you to reconsider and battle every day with your own sort of truth. How can we sort of feel that way about a place? I mean, at least we, when I'm saying we, I mean as an ethnic minority in Hong Kong who's grown up here, Hong Kong redeemed us. That's what people say to me, right? That you have a better life here than you ever would in India, and in fact, you couldn't even talk about gender equality without being harassed, perhaps, in your field. And so, how can you, of all people, have this view that Hong Kong is, so grossly backward in certain ways? So there's this constant contest of realities, and why does it matter, and why it matters to me as an academic, but also as a person, right? My own sort of individual identity. And so from a very legalistic perspective, I want to show you sort of what the discourse has been like in society in Hong Kong. So for about 20 years, there was a lot of lobbying around anti-racial discrimination laws in Hong Kong, and how Hong Kong really needed them because there was no protection under the law for people of minority ethnic status. So the story of the enactment of Hong Kong's race discrimination law tells you quite a fair bit about the history and the deep-rootedness of racism in Hong Kong. And of course, none of this is to say that racism isn't a part of any other society, or that Hong Kong is particularly racist or anything like that. I mean, India is really racist, everywhere is very racist. And that's just, Hong Kong is just a microcosm of the many different forms of exclusion and marginalization we see around the world. So in the late 90s, so close to the handover, the Equal Opportunities Commission did a study on on discrimination in Hong Kong on grounds of race, and they found that 83% of Hong Kong's population opposed legislation for anti-racial discrimination. But if you look at the responses that they received as to the basis why there was no need for such legislation, you can start to see how thin sort of the ground is on which some of these justifications are based. There's also this interesting question, right, to ask. When you're thinking about what a society needs to do to be progressive or to meet its human rights obligations, do you ask, for example, do you ask children, do you want rules that you have to follow, right? Do you want more regulation or less regulation? And so, what has essentially happened happened is people gone out to the community and said, do you think you need more regulation? And a slap on the hand when you do the wrong thing. And of course people say, no, we're fine, it's not a problem. And especially when you're dealing with communities which are not enfranchised, then you have a problem using that sort of approach. Not to say it's not valuable. There's a value, but it's limited in terms of what it can offer you. So some of the justifications, for example, were that mainland Chinese complain about racial discrimination, probably because many of them behave in an antisocial manner. And so they should learn, right, to be better mannered so that they can blend in and not face this kind of discrimination. The interesting thing here about this comment is that race here is equated with the experience of mainland Chinese. So nobody's even thinking about ethnic, well, non-ethnic Chinese population groups and how they're sort of maybe in a different position here. How can anyone think about anti-racial legislation to restrict people's treatment of others on grounds of race when they've not looked into whether the way in which these groups are being treated is because of their own unacceptable behavior? To introduce laws on this basis is utterly ridiculous. So a very heightened, emotive sort of response that this is completely uncalled for. And, self-fixing, look inward and you'll find the problem, and that's all that really needs to be done. So then this exercise was repeated again in 2002, and again the motivation for repeating the exercise was because of repeated calls from the international treaty bodies, which Hong Kong has to answer to for our international obligations, that we have to do something. So this was, okay, let's do something. And at that point, interestingly, 25 out of 34 business groups favored such legislation. So in 5 years, you suddenly had a change. And then all 44 NGOs who were interviewed also favored legislation. So what sort of prompted this change? So at that time, the justifications offered were that, everyone used to think that discrimination is not racial, it's class-based. But then NGOs started campaigning using stories of people, which were designed to highlight how it's not class-based. And so even people who were relatively well off were facing discrimination. So in particular, there were expat bankers arriving in Hong Kong and then, going up to the peak to their rented home and then, turning up, and then the landlord sees that it's an Indian family and then turns them away. And so, they're shocked at that level that I don't get to stay in my, beautiful house on the peak, to a very, very sort of dark story about the death of a Malaysian Indian woman who was a lawyer in one of the hospitals in Hong Kong, and her uttering to her husband, just before she died, that she thought that it was her skin color which put her at the bottom of the pile in terms of the urgency with which she was dealt with when she had a terrible accident. And so Harry's story was really compelling because it broke this myth that discrimination in Hong Kong was something that everyone experienced, and it's about how much money you have. There's also, certain degree of nervousness around Hong Kong's image as a world city and its ability to attract talent, and particularly with our sort of counterpart Asian sort of competitors rising in their sort of profile in the region. There was also a growing acceptance amongst particularly multinational companies around sort of equal opportunities law and how it was okay to have some regulation, and how it was easier to attract talent when they were confident that their interests would be protected effectively. But the existing law on equal opportunity, so in relation to gender equality, disability, discrimination, was still not really attracting litigation. It was more sort of conciliatory in approach, so that was more acceptable as well to businesses. So they thought, it's okay. People can resolve these issues in an amicable manner, and so it won't necessarily make society very litigious. And then, of course, the business case for diversity. For me, the question at that time, or as I look back at the history of this, is that really the conversation that is happening? The responses to Harry's story were shocking. In most cases, shock of that kind would elicit empathy, emotion, a sense of feeling, and a desire to change things and to ensure that that never happens again in Hong Kong. But that's not how the conversation seems to be going. It's more about the business case for diversity and how better diversity principles means more money or more visibility, or Hong Kong being a point of attraction for people of various walks. So why did the conversation not elicit more humane responses? Why did it prompt denial, defensiveness, or protective strategies rather than a desire to sort of atone and fix what was clearly sort of problematic? And what is the right thing to do here? Where's our sense of reflection and shared civic responsibility towards each other, or the drive to do better, or how Hong Kong isn't that place anymore? So some of the government's justifications after that for deciding to legislate was that there's no real problem, there's no antipathy, division, entrenched prejudice regarding any particular group on account of race or ethnicity. It's just a policy. You know, we've got policies in place, and we always try to be harmonious and live together, etc. That was the standard response, and that's why, dear public, we're introducing this anti-race discrimination legislation. And then, of course, we got the, well, we're obliged to do so, so we're doing it, because the international treaty bodies say we must do it. And the specifics really were even more disappointing, because the legislation we now have is much weaker than other laws relating to prohibition of discrimination on other grounds of inequality, such as gender, disability, family status. There are lots of exceptions in the ordinance, or at least a perception that certain government bodies and others are exempted from the provisions. And so, you know, it really sort of led to the question that is it the case that this minority group is less worthy of protection against discriminatory acts, and therefore is it counterproductive? Because law has a number of roles, and one of these is educational, and the other is to serve as a deterrent. But if the law is sending you the message that some people can discriminate and it's fine, or it's okay to discriminate against some people on some grounds but not on others, you then create an internal hierarchy of the level of protection you attract based on who you are. So that's the government's sort of exception, which I'm not going to bore you with. And then some very sort of serious consequences for communities, particularly if they identify with particular national or immigration status. Obviously, the Bills Committee in Hong Kong's Legislative Council were unhappy because this bill did not fulfill our responsibilities as a society, but also not our international obligations. And it demonstrated the government's lack of commitment to tackling the race problem. And a group that was already vulnerable was likely to face even more vulnerability, because who would use a sort of fractured legislation to even think of bringing a claim when you have no guarantee that you're going to succeed in the claim that you're going to make. So everything is on shaky ground. And it sends a very negative message on the whole. So, you know, what is the situation of ethnic minorities in Hong Kong was the kind of question I found myself asking, because with the stories that were coming out, it wasn't compelling enough for anyone to really take seriously the fact that something major needed to be done to overhaul policies and laws and you know, the environment socially in order to make sure that there was greater inclusion and diversity in Hong Kong. So the question was, well, how much do we know and what do we not know? What are our understandings of this population group? And can we relate to what these experiences are? And as an ethnic minority, I found, you know, some of the questions people ask you are very telling about what they think of you or what they don't know about you, or what they think they know about you. And so I started thinking, why are there these impressions, or why are these the standard questions that you get? And the videos I'll show you will highlight some of those, so I'm not going to go into those in great detail right now. But things like, you know, where are you from? And you know, and you say, well, I'm from Hong Kong. I say, no, where are you really from? And then I say, well, I'm a third generation Hong Konger, so I'm from here, thank you. No, but where's your family originally from? And then you say, well, you know, India. I said, but you said you're third generation, so your grandparents and your father studied here, your mother studied here. No, you know, that's not the kind of third generation person I am. So even on sort of your own definition of who you are and what you identify with and where you say you belong, you can have this expansive conversation for about an hour. Or, you know, the next time somebody asks me, where are you from, I just say India. So what does it take to demonstrate your belonging? And some of the stories in the videos, you know, there's a gentleman, Philip Khan, who's a businessman in Hong Kong, speaks fluent Cantonese, and if you talk to him on the phone, you would think he's a person of Chinese origin, and he hasn't been able to get naturalized as a Chinese person. He's got a Pakistani passport. He cannot run for electrical, which is something he wants to do. And his grandfather fought against the Japanese during the occupation of Hong Kong. You know, and he said, I can't become a Chinese national And his question is, what more does it take, right, to demonstrate your loyalty, your commitment, your everything is in Hong Kong? And it goes as far back as 3 generations. And if that's not good enough, then surely it's the color of your skin. What else could it possibly be, right? And it's really disorienting because, I can relate to that. If I go back to India, and I say back in a very strange sense because I never really lived there, but that's where people keep telling us to go back to. When you go home, it's an odd home because it's not home. And people can smell you from a mile away and know that you are a non-resident type of Indian or Pakistani. And so you don't belong there, right? And that is even if you speak the language and, believe in the culture or practice the culture and tradition or whatever it might be. Because belonging is very specific to the attributes you pick up in the place where you grow up. And that a part of that stays with you and never goes away, regardless of what your external sort of experience is like. So I started thinking about what does it take to drive change and get people to do what the right thing is. As a lawyer and a trained lawyer, I thought, it's good enough just to have laws on the books and then people will do what they're supposed to do. A commitment is a commitment, and the stick of the law is good enough. But then I learned it's not so. So what was the kind of urgency? Right, there's the desire to want to do the right thing or to help people see why they should want to do the right thing. But then there's also there's so many things you need to work on, so what's it going to be? And so I thought, what's the urgency? And it again struck me as I sort of noticed some of the kind of language around me about how we're being defined and what people thought. So the media narrative was distinctly negative. So for example, historically a lot of the literature is focused on Vietnamese refugee populations here and the kinds of troubles that we saw coming out of the camps and the kids who are growing up in that sort of environment and the challenges they face in integration. And then of course the whole discourse around Chinese illegal immigrants closer to the handover period and just after. And then more recently we're all very well versed in the kind of rhetoric we see now around refugees and migrants. So there's undocumented migrants, bogus refugees, ethnic minorities, and more recently this term South Asians is cropping a lot in media reports. And interestingly for the EOC, when you talk about, or when you complain and say, well, there's some derogatory language being used, can you say something about that, make a public announcement? The response of the EOC is, well, South Asians is not a race, and so we don't have the mandate to really sort of step in here. But you've got, connecting words in media headlines like South Asians, forming gangs and a part of a major youth problem, for example. So there's a lot there that nothing can or is being done about. And the dominant context in which we see sort of these words or these phrasings appearing is particularly in relation to describing certain type of criminal activity in Hong Kong. And the Justice Center in early last year did a discourse analysis of some of this language around refugees. And you can already see between 2014 and 15, there's a big difference in terms of the frequency of the use of certain types of language and particularly sort of removal, illegal immigrants, and all of these sort of ideas are repeatedly used to describe refugees. And one of the challenges, of course, is how much people know about or understand about refugees and their histories. And we know that there are some synonymous undertones for whatever is said about refugees for Hong Kong's ethnic minorities now, because that's what people think. We're all the same because we have the same color and our heritage is the same. Because at some point or the other, we emigrated to Hong Kong. But you know what? So did everybody else. But people often forget that. So one of the other things that really stuck with me was what I saw in a primary 3 school textbook. And that sort of came to my attention as a result of being a board member on one of the NGOs, Hong Kong Unison, that advocates for the rights of ethnic minorities here. The primary 3 textbook has an exercise for Hong Kong students to complete. And it's basically 2 lists on a page to get. And on the left is a series of occupations, and on the right is a series of nationalities. And their task is to match the occupation with the nationality. And the examples that you can get, you can only think what kind of stereotypes are being fed to this very young, impressionable population group, right? You've got the construction worker who's got to be linked up to be the Pakistani man. You've got a domestic helper who's supposed to be a Filipina. Your white-collar worker who's going to be your white expat. And so all manner of problematic in terms of what students in Hong Kong were learning about us. So in 2015, I put together the Status of Ethnic Minorities report, which documented all the research and existing data that we have already. So it wasn't new research in that way, but really to try to get a sense of where do Hong Kong's ethnic minorities stand on a range of issues. So education, employment, income, poverty, discrimination, experiences, etc. And it is quite a full report. It's available online. It's downloadable. It's about 230 odd pages. There's also a summary of 20 pages if you want to look at that. And it was really, really eye-opening because for the longest time when I've been advocating in international, in international sort of meetings, the impression was that there isn't really a problem because there's no evidence of any problem. So this was really an attempt to compile this evidence so that we can start having a different kind of dialogue about why this is important, why this is relevant, and why this is necessary. So some of the observations were that nobody knows anything about the history of ethnic minorities in Hong Kong. So there's a chart that I produced with the Zoom Foundation, which tracks our history and sort of how we came about being in Hong Kong. So we came in with the very first sort of British armed forces that landed in Hong Kong in 1841, and we then contributed to a number of causes or institutions in Hong Kong, including Hong Kong U, the Star Ferry, a number of public schools, etc. But again, these are things that not very many people know. Maybe that should be taught in schools instead. The ethnic breakdown of the population. So people, again, lack clarity on who we are. So there was sort of a numerical breakdown with what are the largest to the smaller groups of ethnic minorities in our community. So we can see the Indian, Pakistani, Nepalese populations are the largest. There's also an intersectional analysis looking at age and ethnicity. Again, we can see that there are some populations which are aging quicker than others, and then some populations which are much younger than others, so that we're not all the same. There are a lot of distinctions between and within ethnic groups as well. Again, distribution by gender, age, and ethnicity, and I just want to point out the outlier there. The ratio of Pakistani men to women in Hong Kong is 14,000 to 1. In the age group 65 and above. So for some reason, there are all these missing elderly Pakistani women, and I want to know what happened to them. Hong Kong's education system is less likely to receive pre-primary education children who are of an ethnic background, particularly from Pakistani, Nepalese, Filipino communities. We're also more likely to drop out of school in high school. Young ethnic minorities find it difficult to find jobs, and the older ones are working too hard. The participation rate among female ethnic minorities by ethnicity and age, the Pakistani women are the least active in the workforce. Why? Only 12%. There's a racial hierarchy in Hong Kong based on your skin color. The lighter skinned you are, the better you fare, except for those who are Indian Pakistanis and those who are perceived to be Arabic. So that's an anomaly, right? Elementary occupations are predominantly what we do. We're not in professional classes. We earn less than the Hong Kong average, except for Indians. Poverty levels are very serious, particularly among Pakistanis, 50% of whom might be living in a situation of poverty. Child poverty is a very serious problem too. We're more likely to be arrested for crimes, particularly for serious types of crimes. And the term ethnic minority is not one that sits well with us. 63% of us identifies Hong Kong first before our countries of origin. So these are some of the nuances. I'm going to show you a few clips to tell you about what are our experiences.
我一路行，老師唔教我，唔理我，啲同學打我，佢哋話係我 misunderstood， 鬧我差仔，我 misunderstood， 話我爸爸媽媽講粗口話我爸爸媽媽，我 misunderstood。
There's something wrong with the way the system works. How could the government even not have any concern about this whole generation of people And I think that's already a dead end for many of us. I remember just people going to secondary school saying, hey, you make it to Form 3, great. You go to Form 5, bonus. You go past Form 5, it's Mark 6. You know, good on you. But, you know, we just thought, dude, we don't speak Cantonese. I have friends till today who can't speak Cantonese, who studied with me all throughout from primary to secondary. What a waste for Hong Kong. What a shame for Hong Kong.
Asked me to go attend these talks where they're telling me how to be a good beautician or how to do, how you join our company, I'll teach you how to do manicure and pedicure, and I didn't really like it. I was like, why are you telling me this? I'm in Form 4. You're not supposed to tell me how to go for that. You should tell me how to study better and how to have a study habit that would lead me to university.
Were these talks organized by the school?
In collaboration with school. I mean, it was kind of discouraging because I was thinking, okay, my teachers are thinking I cannot make it to university and I need to just stick to these kind of professions that require education.
If you want to learn Chinese, you have to suffer. Because if you want to convince any policy to come out there, 你要 lots of people 嘅 power 咧，去 prove 其實我哋係學到中文。Just the method they use is wrong.
It was a very tough process to learn Cantonese because my parents don't speak it, so I had to go through a lot of struggles, for example, tutorial classes, tutors, classes after school, stuff like that. But over time I was able to communicate in Cantonese and pretty much all the barriers I had with people misunderstanding me would break down.
I was a very nasty kid in primary school. Still the teachers, I think somehow loved me and I loved them too. And I still go back once in a while to meet them.
I am studying Asian and International Studies.
I study in UST, University of Science and Technology, and I'm a first year global business student.
Now I'm a registered social worker.
喺中學教中文嘅老師。
Come on, can you guys get more modern, like, you know, some other slang term, you know, I'm just getting tired of this. 33 years of my life, achao.
其實我同大家一樣都係一個香港人，因為佢土生土長香港，同大家係冇分別。
你嚟自邊度㗎？咁啊，我係印度人啫，但我嚟自香港，因為好香港土生土長，所以香港咧係乜嘢人都有，亦都要記住就係乜嘢人咧都覺得香港係屋企，係因為香港唔係個種族，係個心態，而我嘅心態就係香港精神啦。
Curry every day？ 哦，我想講咧 ，Chinese every day 都係 eat rice 㗎啦。咁點解？
Well, my favorite phrase is 食咗飯未啊？
好靚喎
You know, like Jaya. You know, all the nice phrases.
I want to say I'm a Hong Konger, but I don't know. Should I say that? Okay. Oh, hi, Hong Kong, yeah.
Hang on, Morgan, I got to